For 30 years, 5 nights a week, 46 weeks a year, Johnny Carson walked through a curtain and became the most comfortable person in America. He sat behind a desk in Burbank, California, and 15 million people genuinely felt, that they knew him. They laughed when he laughed. They leaned forward when he paused. They felt his timing in their chests before the punchline landed. His face was so familiar that strangers have described watching him the way you describe sitting with a friend you've known your whole life. Easy, safe, like nothing bad could touch the hour. His fourth wife, Alexis Maas, was with him when he died in January 2005. She was one of maybe 6 people who were. That number is not a tragedy. That was the plan. Johnny Carson controlled access to himself the way other men control property. Carefully, completely, with a system so well designed that even the people inside it rarely noticed the walls. He had 4 marriages, 3 of which ended in divorces expensive enough to land in the national press. He had 3 sons, one of whom died in a car accident while his father was alive. And the grief Carson carried from that, he never discussed publicly, not once. He had colleagues who worked beside him for decades and described him in later years as a man they didn't know. Not a man they had lost touch with, a man they had never reached. Ed McMahon, his announcer for 30 years, the man who said, "Here's Johnny," 10,000 times, once said that in all those years, Carson never once invited him to his home. That fact sits differently depending on when you hear it. Early in the night, with the music playing and the monologue landing, it sounds impossible. Later, after you've spent time with what actually happened, when the cameras went off, it sounds like the most Carson thing imaginable. He was born in Corning, Iowa, in 1925, the middle child of Homer and Ruth Carson. His father was a utility company manager, quiet, steady, largely absent in the emotional sense even when physically present. His mother, Ruth, was the engine of the household, and not in the warm way that word implies. She was demanding, withholding with praise, constitutionally incapable, by most accounts, of expressing affection in any register Carson could receive. He described her this way himself, carefully, in one of the rare interviews where he let something real through. He said she was not a warm woman. He said it the way you say a fact about weather. He discovered magic at age 12, ordering a kit from a magazine, teaching himself tricks, performing for anyone who would watch. By 14, he was performing at local events under the name The Great Carsoni. What drew him to magic is not hard to see in retrospect. You control exactly what the audience sees. You decide what is hidden and what is revealed. The skill is entirely in managing that gap. He went into the Navy at 17, came home, studied radio at the University of Nebraska, and spent the early 1950s working his way through local television in Omaha and then Los Angeles. He was not immediately successful in the way that makes for clean storytelling. There were years of effort, shows that were canceled, rooms that didn't quite work. He was good, and he was getting better, and he was also learning during those years the discipline of the craft, the control, the way a performer makes an audience feel something without the audience understanding the mechanism. When he got The Tonight Show in October 1962, he was 36 years old and already on his second marriage. His first, to Jody Wolcott, had produced 3 sons, Chris, Corey, and Rick. The divorce, in 1963, was not public in the way divorces would later become, but it established a pattern. Carson, on his way up, shedding the life that had formed around the man who existed before the ascent. Joanne Copeland became his second wife, and then Joanne Copeland became his second ex-wife. Then there was Joanna Holland, the third, whose divorce in 1983 cost Carson somewhere between $20 and $40 million, depending on which account you read, a settlement that at the time was reported as one of the most expensive in California history. Joanna hired Marvin Mitchelson, the celebrity divorce attorney, and the proceedings were detailed enough to appear on the front pages of newspapers that did not usually cover divorce. Carson's response to the public nature of that unraveling was to talk about it on television. He made jokes. The audience laughed. He made more jokes. The audience kept laughing. He turned a real catastrophe into material, and in doing so, he did what he had always done. He controlled what the audience saw by showing them something real but processed, real but packaged, real but safe for him to offer. The monologue was always that. The monologue was the most personal he ever got. In person, away from the desk, Carson was by virtually every account a genuinely different creature. The warmth vanished. The ease vanished. What was left was a man who did not know how to be with people in the ordinary, unstructured way that most of us navigate without thinking. Dinner parties made him uncomfortable. Small talk, which most people use as social lubrication, seemed to cause him actual distress. He was not rude, exactly. He was absent. Present in the room and absent in every meaningful sense, watching from somewhere behind his own eyes, waiting for it to be over. He drank. This is documented, not rumored, acknowledged by Carson himself in later years with the kind of careful precision he brought to everything. He drank at parties because parties were harder without it. He drank after shows because shows required everything he had, and the drop afterward was steep. He drank, one senses, because alcohol was one of the few things that softened the glass between himself and other people, without requiring him to dismantle it. His colleague and occasional friend, Dick Cavett, who knew Carson as well as most anyone in television did, described him in an interview after Carson's death as the loneliest man he ever knew. Cavett did not mean lonely in the maudlin sense. He meant it as a structural observation. Carson had built himself into a position where loneliness was the load-bearing wall. Remove it, and the whole thing might come down. The Tonight Show ran on a particular kind of trust. Audiences trusted that the man they were watching was the man who existed. Carson understood this intuitively. He also understood that the man who existed, the private one, the Iowa boy with the cold mother and the magic kit, would not survive that kind of exposure. So he gave them a version, a good version, a skilled version, one that contained real humor and real intelligence and genuine moments of grace, but a version nonetheless. He was famously kind to performers who were nervous. This is well documented. He would find a way to make a young comedian feel safe, ask a follow-up question that opened a door, rescue a stumbling guest with a look or a phrase that reset the room. People who appeared on the show in their early careers, people like Jerry Seinfeld and Roseanne Barr, have talked about what a Carson approval meant, not just for their career, but for their self-belief. He pointed at you from across the desk, and you were real. That was the gift. He could make other people feel seen. The question that follows from that, the one that sits at the center of everything, is whether anyone ever did that for him. His son Rick Carson said in an interview after his father's death that he went years without speaking to him. This was not a dramatic estrangement of the soap opera variety. It was quieter than that and worse. Carson pulled back from his sons after the first divorce in the way men of that era sometimes did, treating fatherhood as a role that could be set aside when the marriage that contained it ended. He supported them financially. He was not there in the way the word "there" actually means. Chris Carson, the oldest, died in August 1991 in a car accident near Reno, Nevada. He was in his 30s. He had been, like his father, interested in photography, and he was on a trip photographing landscapes when the car he was driving went off a mountain road. Carson was taping shows when it happened. He took a brief leave. He came back. He did not discuss Chris's death publicly. He addressed it on air once, briefly, in a way that acknowledged it without opening it. Then it was sealed. People who worked with him said his drinking increased after Chris died. People close to him said he became even harder to reach. Both of these things are consistent with grief and with a man who had no language for grief that he was willing to use in front of another person. He retired from The Tonight Show in May 1992, and the retirement special, which drew one of the largest television audiences in the show's history, showed him crying. Actually crying, not the one tear on the cheekbone kind, but genuinely emotional, saying goodbye to something he had built and controlled for 30 years. He thanked his staff. He thanked his audience. He was, for those minutes, more openly emotional than he had been in any single broadcast moment across 3 decades. And then he went to Malibu and essentially disappeared. The disappearance was not accidental. He bought a house on the beach, and he lived in it, and he did not call people, and when people called him, he often did not call back. He watched television. He played tennis. He read. He remained, by all accounts, genuinely interested in science and astronomy, interests he had cultivated his whole adult life, and that required nothing of other people. He occasionally sent letters, sometimes funny, sometimes touching, but always letters, never phone calls, never visits. The distance was the medium. Jay Leno, who succeeded him on The Tonight Show, tried to maintain a connection. Carson would occasionally send him jokes, anonymously at first, and then with his name attached. He watched Leno's show. He did not appear on it. He did not appear on any show. He gave one interview in those retirement years to David Letterman's CBS program, and even that was conducted under conditions that Carson largely controlled. Letterman, for his part, had a relationship with Carson that illustrates the whole picture in miniature. Carson admired Letterman enormously, said so privately, sent him jokes and notes, was, from a distance, a genuine mentor figure. He was at the same time essentially unavailable. Letterman described this in an interview once as the most Carson thing in the world. To be generous and unreachable at the same time. To give you something and then close the door. He married Alexis Maas in 1987, 4 years after his third divorce. She was 32 years old when they married. He was 61. She was, by most accounts, devoted, and the marriage lasted until his death, which is its own kind of data point. But even in that marriage, even in that last chapter, the accounts suggest a man who had reduced his world to something he could manage. A small number of rooms, a small number of people, a set of routines that kept the noise out. He was diagnosed with emphysema in his later years. He had smoked for most of his adult life, including during tapings when the cameras weren't directly on him. The disease narrowed his life physically in the same years it was already narrowed by design. He died on January 23, 2005, at age 79. The cause was listed as respiratory failure from emphysema. The obituaries were enormous. Every network ran long tributes. The footage from 30 years of shows played on loop for days. The nation went through a genuine collective mourning, the kind that happens when someone has been in your living room, reliably, for so long that their absence feels like a structural change in the house. Comedians who had built careers on his approval were visibly broken by the news. Men who had spent their whole working lives trying to get through that curtain were in tears talking about what it meant that he was gone. Almost none of them had spoken to him in years. That gap between the magnitude of the grief and the smallness of the actual human connection in those final years is what you carry when you spend real time with his story. He was mourned like a friend by millions of people who were not his friends. He was mourned like a father by a country that got more warmth from him than his own children sometimes did. He was remembered as the most comfortable presence on American television by people who could not have found his phone number. Gary Gill, his longtime producer, said after his death that Carson was the most private person he had ever known. Gill had worked beside him for 20 years. He meant it as a tribute, describing Carson's privacy as a kind of integrity, a refusal to sell himself entirely, a maintenance of something genuinely his own in an industry designed to strip that away. That reading is not wrong. It is also not complete. What Carson kept private was not just his inner life. It was his capacity for relationship itself. The privacy was not a room he went to alone. It was the only room he knew how to live in. There is a version of this story where the moral is simpler. Famous man was lonely, isolation kills. But that version doesn't account for the fact that Carson chose this, consciously, across decades, and that the choice produced one of the most sustained and extraordinary performances in the history of the medium. He gave America something real every night for 30 years. The cost of that, the internal cost, was something he paid privately, without receipts, without testimony, without asking anyone to understand. He was called, at various points, the King of Late Night. He was called, in one well-known phrase attributed to people who worked with him, the most famous stranger in America. Both things were true. They were two sides of the same mechanism. The magic trick, the one he had been perfecting since he was 14 years old in Iowa, went like this. You show them everything, and they never see a thing.